Hey, what's up everyone? I'm back again with another tutorial, but this time I thought I'd try something out a little bit different. Rather than sitting through me coding and fixing bugs for 30 minutes, I figured I'd try and make these tutorials a little bit quicker and a little bit more engaging. Hopefully you enjoy these changes, feel free to suggest any improvements in the comments below, but with that all being said, let's dive straight in. Before we get started with the tutorial, we'll take a quick look at our final product for today. We have a radial menu in which we can navigate through all of our options, have something react to whichever option we're hovering on, as well as whenever we select something, have an action performed. In this case, I have a debug log, but we could make really anything. So let's go ahead and take a quick preview of all the things we're going to be using in this project. So as far as assets, I have just some art, which are just simple sprites that I've either made myself or got off the internet. Just this simple scene that we're in right now. Some scripts, only 2 of them. This one is pretty short. We'll talk about that when we get to it. I've imported TextMesh Pro just for some cleaner text because Unity default text sucks. We have a single prefab, which we will cover on how to make. But if we go ahead and take a look at the hierarchy, we just have our main camera with the background set to black, just to get rid of that ugly blue default color. We have a canvas with the canvas scaler set, but of course this depends on your project, how you want to scale this. I have it set to scale to 1920 by 1080 so that as we resize the window, the menu scales accordingly. We have a menu base object. I've just created an empty canvas object, made sure that it's centered in the middle. You can of course change the anchor position as well as the position of the menu to fit your needs. We have this base circle, which is this circle sprite right here. And also on this base circle is the menu manager script. The main thing of note here is that I have a choices array in which all of these menu buttons sit. Right now they're all stacked on top of each other because I lay them out in the script. And we can also have methods of like programmatically generating these prefabs, but I figured for the purposes of this tutorial it's simpler to just have everything in an array so you can see where everything is coming from. We have an onHover event, which is controlling this text object right here, which is the center text you see. We have a holder empty object. This just is a parent for all the options so that when we do some rotations we can rotate this rather than rotating the entire base circle, which would also rotate our text, which is kind of annoying. And within each of these we have a menu button prefab. This prefab is just a image with the menu button script on it. I've gone ahead and used this hollow circle script and then set the fill amount to 0.15 here, but that of course is also set programmatically depending on how many options there are. I haven't really done much else other than that, but we just have this hollow circle script acting as our little buttons here. And with underneath these is just the image that sits in the center, whether that's the ghost or the magnifying glass, just kind of haphazardly positioned and slapped on there. But so this is the menu manager script. If you recall, that was the one sitting on the base circle in our hierarchy. So this input delay float, this is what controls sort of the input speed that the player can input at, because remember when we're querying for input in the update loop, it runs essentially once every frame, and if a player is holding down an input key, the menu would cycle way too fast for them to really keep track of, or like, it would get pretty annoying. So we have some sort of delay so that we don't do that. I've found through testing that 0.3 is a generally good value. You could adjust that based on your game. Now this fill amount is sort of named in parallel to what it will be doing. The fill amount of the hollow circle, if we go back to Unity here and click on this, if we play around with this, you'll see that's what controls the size of the buttons, but we will be setting that programmatically. The reason I have it at 0.95 and not 1 is because I wanted some gaps in between the buttons, which we will well, if we hit play right here, actually, you can see the little gaps between the buttons. If I'd set the fill amount to evenly divided by however many options there were, we'll see the math in a minute, then there wouldn't have been gaps, which doesn't look as clean in my opinion. The option holder is just a reference to the transform of this holder here that holds the options. Pretty self-explanatory. We have the menu button prefab, which is this object right here, in case we want to programmatically instantiate any of the buttons later on. This didn't end up being used in this version because I switched over to the array method instead. This animation curve, since I'm doing the animations programmatically as well, I've gone ahead and set myself up with this animation curve. You could, however, create animations through the animator and the animation clip system. I can cover that in a second tutorial if you'd like. But for the simple nature of this menu system, I figured programmatic animations would be just fine. You can see that in the curve, I've added some juice. It kind of dips below, kind of overshoots, and then comes back. Notice one thing that is important is that it ends at 0.3. It doesn't need to end at 0.3. What's important is that it ends at the same value that your input delay is set to. Because otherwise you won't get perfect back and forth animations, which I will talk about. I've used the same curve for both the menu button curve as well as the menu manager curve, just because it's a good curve. This is the array for the options that we assign in the inspector. This I will talk about later as we get towards the end of the tutorial. And then some private variables to handle input. So whether or not the player can input at this very moment, you could maybe add methods in to change this based on game states in your own games. But for now, this is just here to show. Our private float to track the last input time so we can actually use this input delay that we've made. And finally, a choice index to track which choice we are, or which choice we are selecting in this array of choices that we have. So in our start method, start is called once at the beginning of the scene. If our choices is less than 1, so if we have 0 choices, then we just return, because otherwise we get nasty errors with dividing by 0 and stuff here. And also there's nothing to do if there's 0 choices, but essentially we loop through all of the choices. The first thing we do is we set their rotation. So we want them to be evenly scattered around this base circle. So we go ahead and I'm not going to cover quaternions. I can make a separate video about that if you'd like, but we're just going to work with Euler here, so our regular x, y, z rotations. We don't need any rotation on the x or y. Instead, on the z rotation, we just multiply the index of the choice in the array. So the first option will be 0, the second option will be 1, times 360, the number of degrees in a circle. Notice the f here, that is important so that we don't get integer division, and instead we get a decimal value. And we divide that by the number of choices there are. So we divide the circle evenly into however many choices we need, and then set the rotation to the index of the choice times that even split value. Next, we have the anchored position, which I've set to 0. So I went ahead and removed that line. I left that line in because of testing stuff. My mistake. This line right here accesses the image component of the choice and sets the fill amount to that fill amount we talked about earlier, divided by the number of choices. So same principle as here. Just here the fill amount is less than 1, so we get those little gaps that make the UI really pop, you know? Next up, we have the option holder dot rotation. Now, by default, you'll notice that our choices are off-center because of the way that the radial fill here works. The locations we can select aren't very helpful, and if we go ahead and slide this up to 1, you can see that it's kind of dividing the circle right here and then giving us our fill amount. So rather than do that, we need to essentially align this this arc here. I think that's the term for segments of a circle. We need to align that to be on the top here because that's what we're going for. If you want it on the side or the bottom or the left side, just multiply by 90 or 180 or negative 90 depending on what you need. But I did some math and it turns out you can actually set that pretty easily. Well, easily. Same principle, we're setting the rotation on the x and y to 0 because we don't need to rotate on that. And the z will be 360, again, circles. times our fill amount at 0.95 divided by the number of choices divided by 2. So that puts it halfway. So that moves half of the circle over to the rotation that we want, putting it right at the center of the top. Perfect. Next, I go ahead and essentially tell the menu, all right, we're ready to begin. Go ahead and select the first option and make sure that the player knows that we're hovering on that, or the system know that we're hovering on that. And then on hover.invoke, again, we'll talk about events towards the end, but we can cover this coroutine once we get down into the main loop, because it's also going to show up there. And finally, we set can input to true, because we're done with all of our menu setup stuff, so now we can begin to accept player inputs, which happens down here in the update loop. In the update loop, we go ahead and do a couple of preliminary checks. So if there are less than one choice, or if there are 0 choices, then we just return, there's nothing for us to do. If we can't input, we just return, there's nothing for us to do. I separated these out just for clarity. If we inputted within the last 0.3 seconds, we return, because we're delaying our input to avoid speedy menus. So once the player submits a menu option, we just go ahead and call that menu button's press method, which we will cover again once we get to the menu button script. But essentially we tell the button that it's been pressed and then let it deal with whatever it needs to do. Depending on your game, you may want to disable a menu or stop accepting player input. You can change this return statement to do whatever you need it to do. I just return because there's no reason to continue taking input until the next input cycle, or the next update cycle, rather. Finally, the main meat of the cycling part. We go ahead and we make a float input that grabs the horizontal axis of player input. Again, that's defined over here in Edit, Project Settings, Input. If you go through the axes, you can go ahead and see that there are horizontal. And there are actually 2 horizontal. If you name 2 axes the same thing, both of those inputs get used for that horizontal axis. This is for a joystick, this is for left, right, A or D. Those are set up by Unity by default, but if you want to change those or use a different axis, you can. Now, if the player isn't inputting anything, there's no reason for us to do anything, so we just return. So what we do once we've confirmed that the player has input in a direction, I use horizontal for left and right. Depending on your menu configuration, you may want to use vertical for up and down, but essentially we have input here. So let's go ahead and deselect the current option, increment the option, rotate the circle, and then select the other option, or select the new option. So this little ternary statement right here, what this does is it increments choice index based on whether the input was left or right. If it was left, it goes -1, so choice index -1, so it goes backwards. If it was to the right that we inputted, then we increment positively and move down the array that we've defined up there. Next, I make sure that the choice index doesn't exceed the bounds of the array. So this little mod function here is just because I had this laying around, so I figured I might as well use it. You could use like the modulus operator, but that doesn't quite work if you're at negative values correctly. But essentially it just returns length -1 if we're less than 0, so it loops back to the end of the array if we go below 0. Or if we go above the length of the array, it loops back to 0. And then we just return that. So that's all the mod does. The rotate circle, I've gone ahead and done a coroutine here, as much to my chagrin, just because I didn't want to deal with clogging up the update function. To rotate the circle, we simply find a goal rotation, take our current rotation, and then slurp between the two. Let me explain what this math right here is. So the goal rotation is essentially we want to move one menu button length rotation so that the next menu button is centered. So we take the choice index that we're at, the menu, or like the menu option that we want to go to, the index of the menu option we want to go to, multiply it by the segment that each menu option takes up, and then add that little half increment that centers the option that we did at the very top in the start method, if you recall. Next, our current rotation, kind of self-explanatory, it's our current rotation. And then we have a little start time. I've gone ahead and made this animation last as long as the input delay because we know for sure that the player will not be inputting during that input delay. So we can just have the animation complete in that time. And it will slurp from our current rotation to the goal rotation based on the animation curve. We just evaluate it at that time, dot time minus start time. So when we started minus the current time, and then as the time dot time minus start time approaches 0.3, we will have reached the end of the curve and the animation will have completed, and then we are done. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the menu button. So the menu button has a public float, the selected emphasis. So this is the little juice factor of when we press play, how much this little thing pops out by. I've gone ahead and done 1.6 just because that was the first value that sprang to my mind. This is again that animation curve that controls those animation like juiciness. Okay, after that animation curve, we have our selected option color. It's a little color tint that happens whenever we select an option. We have an event for the on press. So this is because the Unity event system, or the Unity UI system, has these handy dandy on press events that people use. Like say I created a button here. Let's go ahead and create a UI button. You'll notice that this button has an on click that is often useful whenever you're doing any UI work, which is really nice because these sort of events sync pretty well with Unity specific stuff. So I've gone ahead and just used the Unity event system rather than creating our own. In start, all I've done is add that little debug log thing that we've pressed this button that is down here. That's all this does. Yo, this button was pressed. Go ahead and add that space in there for clarity, but yeah, yo, this button was pressed. That's all that happens whenever this onPress event is invoked. So again, I've done the coroutines for animations. If you want the tutorial with the animations system, please go ahead and let me know in the comments again. So the animation principle is essentially the same. We just transition the scale of the button up to, or this is for deselect, so we transition it down from whatever it's currently scaled up to just its normal 1, 1, 1 scale. This is just shorthand for writing vector 3 of 1, 1, 1. And again, we use the curve to handle the speed of that transition. And we also go ahead and lerp the color back to completely white. You can have another parameter for this, but I figured we just go back to the default white, again controlled by the curve. This yield return null means wait until the next frame to continue this while loop. This just makes it so that the animation can actually be seen by the human eye and isn't done in exactly 3 frames. So that being said, let's go ahead and look at the select one. Pretty much the same thing, except we're lerping from our current local scale to our vector 3.1 times our selected emphasis. This is what controls, again, the scale of the menu button when it is selected. And similarly, we lerp the color from white to the selected option color. And then finally, we have a public method, which is just press. All this does is start our press animation. So this, I've essentially copied the select and deselect coroutines, very much the same. The only thing is I've changed it from taking in this float time to control how long the animation takes to just hard coding 0.15. Again, not great practice, but just for the sake of this tutorial, I figured it wouldn't matter too much. Essentially, it deselects in 0.15 seconds, invokes the onPress event, so calling any methods that are subscribed to that event, and then reselects it so that we go back to the selected state we had before we pressed the button. So finally, let's go back and take a look at this stupid test event. So unfortunately, Unity event doesn't support serialization whenever you have a parameter, which is what we need when we want to get information back. So in this case, I wanted a string back so I could change the little text here in the center to the name of the button. You can see I've named them here in the hierarchy. So I've gone ahead and done a string. You can do any other serializable type, those will show up. But Unity likes generics, or doesn't like generics, and would prefer primitives or other things that it knows how to serialize and display in the inspector. You can see I've marked this with the system.serializable to let Unity know, hey, this only contains primitive types. You can serialize this and display it in the inspector. So essentially all of that just to get it to show up here. Whenever we go to base circle, we have this onHover event, and then we can click this little plus button here to add any other event that we want affected by the string parameter that is passed to us. Now where is that string parameter passed? The delete key didn't work there. That string parameter is passed by us. We get to choose what to pass back. So right here, this onHover.invoke, all this does is it sends a message to the event, hey, it's time to do your thing. Here is the string parameter that you need. Tell all of the methods that you have as subscribers that, yo, this is the string we got, do what you will. I've just passed in the name here, as well as right here, I've gone ahead and passed in the name of the currently selected choice. So ultimately what that achieves, the only method that is subscribed to this event is this one I've added in through the inspector right here. All this does is it grabs the text object and then grabs its text component and the text field and then slaps the text in there. So if we go ahead and hit play, you can see that the text updates as expected. Whew, alright, that was menus in Unity. Hopefully that was pretty good. Feel free to leave any questions or concerns in the comments below, and any other future suggestions for tutorials as well. See you next time.